Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The information presented in this documentary is intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. While we delve deeply into psychological studies, behavioral trends, and family dynamics, this content does not constitute professional psychiatric, medical, or legal advice. Navigating the complexities of divorce involves intricate personal, legal, and mental health challenges. Always seek the guidance of qualified professionals, such as licensed therapists, family law attorneys, or medical providers, regarding your specific circumstances. Viewers must conduct their own due diligence before making any life-altering decisions based on the themes discussed herein. Imagine a man sitting in the driver's seat of a parked car on a Sunday evening. The engine is off, the street is quiet, and the front door of the house he once owned has just closed. Inside that house are his children, his former life, and the remnants of an identity he spent a decade building. He is now driving back to a sparsely furnished apartment alone. In the clinical world of psychology, this moment is not merely a difficult life transition. It is classified as an acute trauma event. Yet society often brushes past this silent devastation, wrapping it in dark humor or dismissive stereotypes about the weekend bachelor. The shocking reality, backed by decades of behavioral research and clinical case studies, is that the psychological deterioration of the divorced American father is one of the most undocumented and misunderstood mental health crises of the modern era. Studies indicate that men face a substantially elevated risk of severe clinical depression, profound isolation, and a catastrophic loss of identity in the immediate aftermath of a marital dissolution. We are looking at a demographic that experiences a mortality rate up to 2.5 times higher than their married counterparts, driven largely by stress-related illnesses and a complete collapse of emotional support systems. But what if the mainstream narrative, the one that paints men as either emotionally impenetrable or entirely at fault for their domestic unraveling, is completely wrong? What do the clinical psychologists, the sociologists, and the longitudinal behavioral studies actually say happens to the male brain when the family unit is fractured by court order? For years, researchers have quietly compiled data on the cognitive dissonance experienced by men who are abruptly transitioned from the role of patriarch and daily protector to what is coldly termed a non-custodial parent. We uncovered restricted academic research, buried clinical assessments, and decades of forgotten data that reveal a terrifying, highly predictable psychological timeline every divorced father goes through. More importantly, this research reveals a profound open loop, a specific identifiable behavioral pivot point that dictates exactly which men will succumb to the psychological pressure, and which men will undergo a radical cognitive restructuring to rebuild their lives. There is a hidden architecture to this suffering, and once you understand the blueprints, the entire narrative shifts. The problem millions of Americans face today, whether you are a man standing on the precipice of a failing marriage, a son trying to understand your father's distant behavior, or a professional working within the family court system, is a fundamental lack of psychological literacy regarding this specific trauma. We operate on cultural myths rather than empirical data. This documentary is the definitive response to that deficit. Over the course of this extensive exploration, we are going to provide you with a masterclass in the psychological mechanisms of the divorced father. We are going to dismantle the stereotypes and replace them with rigorous clinical insights, historical trends, and observable behavioral science. You are going to learn exactly why the American legal structure, particularly the advent of no-fault divorce in the 1970s, created a unique psychological battleground for men, fundamentally altering the way fathers attach to and detach from their offspring. We will meticulously unpack the concept of disenfranchised grief. Unlike the grief experienced after a physical death, which society meets with casseroles, paid leave, and profound sympathy, the grief of a divorced dad is an ambiguous loss. He is grieving the loss of his children's daily presence, the loss of his financial stability, and the loss of his societal role, all while the people he is grieving are still alive and often openly hostile toward him. We will detail exactly how this continuous, unresolved grief spikes cortisol levels, disrupts the endocrine system, and physically alters the neuroplasticity of the male brain. Through comprehensive case studies, we will show you how this specific type of grief manifests in the modern American man, often masking itself as workaholism, sudden behavioral erraticism, or profound social withdrawal. Furthermore, we will systematically analyze the psychological phenomenon known as identity foreclosure. For many American men, their entire psychological framework is built upon the pillars of providing and protecting. When a judge's gavel strikes, those pillars are not just shaken, they are legally disassembled. We will explore the step-by-step cognitive crisis that occurs when a man realizes his primary utility to his family has been reduced to a monthly child support transfer. How does the male ego, deeply ingrained with evolutionary and societal mandates to lead a family, process being relegated to an every other weekend visitor in his own children's lives? We will look at the potential outcomes of this identity crisis, examining both the destructive paths of alienation and the constructive paths of profound self-reinvention. This is not a space for assigning blame or wallowing in resentment. This is a rigorous, unflinching examination of reality. By understanding the historical trends of family law and its intersection with male psychology, we equip ourselves with the ultimate tool for navigation: awareness. We will dissect the coping mechanisms documented by top-tier psychiatrists, differentiating between maladaptive avoidance strategies and the highly effective cognitive behavioral techniques utilized by men who successfully integrate this trauma. We will analyze the shifting dynamics of fatherhood in America, the psychological toll of parental alienation syndrome, and the brutal financial psychology required to start over from absolute zero at the age of 40 or 50. By the end of this journey, the confusion surrounding the divorced dad stereotype will be completely eradicated. You will possess a comprehensive, academically grounded understanding of the emotional and cognitive war being waged in the minds of millions of American men. You will see the specific case studies of those who have navigated the abyss and emerged with a stronger, more resilient sense of self. This knowledge is not just power. It is the fundamental prerequisite for survival, empathy, and the eventual rebuilding of the American family dynamic. We are pulling back the curtain on the silent struggles, the hidden data, and the profound psychological resilience required to survive the modern American divorce. To understand the magnitude of this psychological event, we must first look at the immediate biological and neurological fallout that occurs in the first 72 hours of physical separation. Clinical psychologists refer to this as the acute displacement phase. When a man is abruptly removed from his primary residence, his central nervous system does not register this as a simple change of address. The human brain, shaped by thousands of years of evolutionary biology, interprets this sudden isolation from the family unit as an existential threat. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes hyperactive. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the bloodstream, creating a prolonged state of fight or flight. But there is nothing to fight and nowhere to flee. The threat is invisible, institutional, and emotional. Imagine a man named Michael, 42 years old, living in Ohio in the year 2026. He works as a mid-level logistics manager. On a Tuesday, he is a husband and a father living in a 4-bedroom house, deeply embedded in the daily rhythm of his children's lives. By Friday, following a temporary separation or an escalated domestic dispute that resulted in his departure to de-escalate the situation, he is sitting on a borrowed mattress in a sterile apartment. The sudden silence he experiences is not just deafening, it is biologically disorienting. His circadian rhythm, previously synced to the morning chaos of getting kids to school, shatters. Sleep fragmentation begins immediately. Studies show that men in the first 6 months of a forced household separation experience a severe drop in slow-wave sleep, the restorative phase crucial for emotional regulation and cognitive function. Without this baseline biological stability, emotional volatility is not just a potential outcome, it is a physiological certainty. This biological vulnerability collides violently with a psychological phenomenon known as disenfranchised grief. Traditional grief, such as mourning the death of a spouse, is culturally recognized. Society surrounds the widower with a scaffolding of support, offering meals, time off work, and profound empathy. The grief of the divorced father, however, is a disenfranchised loss. It is a profound mourning for a family that is still physically alive. Michael is grieving the loss of his identity, his daily proximity to his children, his financial security, and his envisioned future. Yet, society often meets this specific type of grief with suspicion, apathy, or the implicit assumption that he must have done something to deserve it. This lack of social validation forces the grief underground. Clinical assessments of recently divorced men reveal that when grief is unacknowledged by the community, it metabolizes into internalized anger, toxic shame, or severe clinical depression. The man is essentially suffocating in a vacuum, completely deprived of the social oxygen required to process trauma. Let us examine the historical trends of male socialization to understand why this is so catastrophic. For generations, American men have been conditioned to derive their core psychological stability from their utility as providers and protectors. This is not merely a cultural construct. It is deeply embedded in the psychology of fatherhood. When a family fractures, the legal system often reduces this multifaceted identity into a singular, sterile metric of child support. We are looking at a radical cognitive dissonance. The man who was once the emotional anchor, the coach, the disciplinarian, and the nighttime storyteller is legally rebranded as a non-custodial parent and a financial obligor. Psychiatrists call this identity foreclosure. The man's identity is effectively foreclosed upon and liquidated. Case studies from longitudinal behavioral research indicate that when a man's primary avenue for expressing love and value, his daily physical presence and provision, is restricted to alternate weekends, the male ego collapses inward. He looks in the mirror and cannot reconcile his internal sense of self as a father with the external reality of being a visitor in his children's lives. This is the exact pivot point where the statistics become grim. This is where the isolation takes root. Men in this acute phase often withdraw completely from their remaining social networks. The shame of the failed marriage, compounded by the inability to articulate their complex grief, leads to an intentional self-exile. Stop attending social gatherings, they distance themselves from mutual friends to avoid awkwardness, and they isolate themselves in their new, diminished living spaces. The data from recent mental health surveys shows a stark reality. The social circle of a married man is largely maintained by his spouse. When the marriage ends, the social infrastructure vanishes simultaneously with the family infrastructure. This compound isolation is the primary driver behind the alarming mortality and morbidity rates among divorced men. The stress ceases to be purely emotional and begins manifesting physically. Historical trends in cardiovascular health show a marked increase in stress-induced hypertension and systemic inflammation among men navigating contested divorces. The body is essentially keeping the score of a game the man does not understand how to play, let alone win. Consider the psychological cognitive load placed on a man who must now navigate this profound biological and emotional crisis, while simultaneously attempting to maintain his professional performance. The logistics manager we called Michael still has to manage his team, meet his quotas, and perform at a high level to afford the sudden duplication of living expenses. He is expected to compartmentalize the most devastating emotional trauma of his life between the hours of 9 and 5. There is no bereavement leave for the death of a family structure. He must smile, lead meetings, and analyze data while internally managing a cortisol cascade and the crushing weight of disenfranchised grief. The mental bandwidth required simply to exist in this dual state leaves virtually no cognitive reserves for healing or strategic planning. To cope with this overwhelming deficit, many men adopt maladaptive behavioral strategies out of sheer desperation. One heavily documented phenomenon is the emergence of the compensatory parent, colloquially known in sociological studies as the Disneyland dad. Driven by the agonizing guilt of their absence and the terror of losing their children's affection, fathers in the acute phase of divorce often attempt to compress a month's worth of parenting into a single weekend. Case studies reveal a pattern of frantic overcompensation. The father, terrified that his children will forget him or prefer their primary residence, abandons all previous disciplinary structures. He replaces routine and boundaries with excessive gifting, constant entertainment, and a desperate need to curate perfect memories. While this may temporarily soothe the father's anxiety, developmental psychologists warn that it fundamentally destabilizes the children, who crave consistency and normalcy during a chaotic transition, not a relentless vacation. This desperate overcompensation is a direct manifestation of a man trying to purchase the psychological security that was stripped from him. When the weekend ends, the crash is catastrophic. The silence of the apartment returns, the financial strain of the excessive spending sets in, and the cognitive dissonance deepens. The man realizes that despite his frantic efforts, he cannot buy his way back into the role of a daily father. This brings us to a critical intersection where psychology meets the real world. The biological shock, the disenfranchised grief, and the identity foreclosure create a perfect storm of vulnerability. The divorced father is operating at a profound cognitive and emotional deficit. His decision-making capabilities are compromised by sleep deprivation and trauma. His self-worth has been legally and socially devalued. He is isolated, exhausted, and desperately searching for a way to stop the bleeding and regain some semblance of control over his rapidly disintegrating life. And it is exactly in this highly vulnerable, biologically compromised state that he is forced to step into an arena designed not for healing, but for adversarial combat. The psychological breakdown we have just documented is merely the precursor to the real test. What happens when a man, already pushed to the absolute limits of his mental endurance, is forced to defend his very right to be a father inside an institution that inherently views him as a liability? When a man, already pushed to the absolute limits of his mental endurance, is forced to defend his very right to be a father inside an institution that inherently views him as a liability, he is not merely entering a legal proceeding. He is walking into an environment optimized to trigger his most deeply embedded neurological defense mechanisms. The legal arena is structurally adversarial. It demands a winner and a loser. But in the context of family dissolution, applying a win-lose framework to the psychological bond between a father and his children creates an institutional trauma that compounds the initial biological shock. Sociologists and legal scholars have documented a phenomenon known as legal abuse syndrome, a form of post-traumatic stress disorder directly caused by prolonged exposure to the adversarial justice system. For the divorced father, this is not an abstract concept. It is his Tuesday morning reality. To grasp why the system feels fundamentally hostile to the male psyche, we must examine the historical trends of family law. For decades, the tender years doctrine dominated American jurisprudence, operating on the explicit legal presumption that mothers were the uniquely essential caregivers for young children, while fathers were primarily financial providers. Although this doctrine was officially dismantled and replaced with gender-neutral best interest of the child standards, the cultural hangover persists within the structural biases of many courtrooms. The psychological impact on a father entering this system is profound. He immediately senses that he is not entering on equal footing. He begins his legal journey not from a position of established parental equality, but from a deficit, bearing the burden of proving his psychological and emotional value to his own children against an ingrained historical bias. Imagine a man named David, a 38-year-old architect living in Texas in 2026. David has spent the last 10 years building a life, coaching local youth sports, and managing the household infrastructure. Upon entering the divorce process, David is required to read a sworn affidavit submitted by his soon-to-be ex-wife's legal counsel. This document, designed specifically to maximize legal leverage, meticulously reconstructs the past decade of his life, reframing every argument, every missed dinner due to work, and every human flaw as evidence of parental unfitness. For a man already suffering from identity foreclosure, reading a legally binding document that systematically assassinates his character is a catastrophic psychological event. Clinical observations show that men in this exact scenario frequently experience acute physiological reactions, mimicking severe panic attacks. Their brain is attempting to process a dual reality: the man they know themselves to be versus the dangerous liability described in the legal filings. This cognitive dissonance forces the amygdala back into a state of hyperarousal. David is not just fighting for his assets, he is fighting to defend his fundamental reality and his sanity. Between the initial separation and the final decree lies the psychological purgatory of temporary orders. These initial rulings, often made rapidly with limited evidence during crowded docket days, dictate the immediate status quo of custody and support. Psychologists note that temporary orders frequently establish a disastrous psychological baseline. If a father is granted minimal access during this phase, perhaps alternating weekends, the court effectively establishes a new normal for the children. As months drag into years awaiting a final trial, the father is forced to prove why this established status quo should be changed, fighting an uphill battle against the sheer inertia of the court calendar. This prolonged state of suspended animation prevents any actual psychological healing. The father cannot grieve the past because he is perpetually preparing for the next hearing, trapped in a chronic state of anticipatory anxiety and hypervigilance. Then comes the psychological warfare of financial depletion. The American family court system requires immense capital, retainers, hourly billing, mandatory mediation fees, and child custody evaluators drain resources at an alarming velocity. For a man whose psychological stability has historically been tied to his ability to provide financial security, this systemic drainage is terrifying. We observe case studies where men exhibit symptoms mirroring severe resource scarcity trauma. They begin obsessively monitoring bank accounts, experiencing severe insomnia related to potential financial ruin, and making panicked, short-term decisions that jeopardize their long-term stability. The fear is not simply about having less money. It is the primal terror of being stripped of the very mechanism that society has told them is their primary justification for existing within the family unit. When a man realizes that his capacity to build wealth is being actively leveraged against him to fund the legal machinery dismantling his access to his children, a profound and dangerous cynicism often takes root. Faced with the overwhelming combination of character assassination and financial hemorrhage, many men exhibit a trauma response that legal professionals often misinterpret as apathy, the freeze response. Unlike the compensatory parent who frantically overschedules weekend activities, the man in a freeze state becomes paralyzed by the perceived futility of the legal battle. Behavioral psychologists note that when the required effort to maintain a relationship with one's children becomes associated with extreme financial distress and continuous emotional distress via litigation, the brain's self-preservation instincts intervene. The man may begin missing deadlines with his attorney, failing to respond to aggressive communications, or agreeing to highly unfavorable custody terms simply to make the psychological pressure stop. Opposing counsel and even judges frequently interpret this withdrawal as a lack of interest in the children or an admission of guilt. In reality, it is a documented, involuntary trauma response. The man is essentially playing dead to survive the institutional mauling. Throughout this process, the father undergoes a forced depersonalization. He sits in sterile conference rooms, listening to attorneys negotiate his relationship with his children, as if they were dividing shares of a corporate asset. He is reduced to a plaintiff or a respondent, a percentage of parenting time, and a child support calculation formula. This mechanical processing of human attachment strips away the nuance of fatherhood. The legal system demands quantifiable metrics, overnight counts, holiday rotation schedules, and income brackets. But the essence of fatherhood is largely unquantifiable. It is the spontaneous conversation on a Tuesday evening, the impromptu guidance, the silent physical presence in a home. By forcing the father to justify his existence through the cold geometry of a court order, the system fundamentally invalidates the emotional core of his paternal identity. Eventually, the litigation fatigue reaches its absolute peak. The financial resources are depleted, the emotional reserves are entirely exhausted, and a final decree is stamped by a judge. The father receives a bound document dictating precisely when and where he is legally permitted to be a parent. For a fleeting moment, there is a profound sense of relief. The adversarial phase is seemingly over. The boundaries are strictly set. He believes that if he just follows the court order to the letter, he will finally find peace and begin rebuilding his relationship with his children on this new, albeit restricted, foundation. But this assumption relies on a critical, often fatal miscalculation. It assumes that the other party will respect the authority of the court order. It assumes the emotional conflict has ended just because the legal one has. What happens when the legal battle concludes, but the psychological warfare enters a darker, more covert phase? What happens when a father arrives for his legally mandated weekend, only to find the house empty, the children's cell phones turned off, and a new terrifying dynamic taking hold of his children's minds? This is the terrifying reality of custody gatekeeping, an insidious process that frequently devolves into what clinical psychologists study under the umbrella of alienating behaviors. When a father stands on an empty porch, clutching a legally binding custody schedule, while his phone calls go straight to voicemail, he experiences a unique psychological rupture. The court order, the document he spent his life savings to secure, is suddenly revealed to be nothing more than a piece of paper. If he calls law enforcement, he is almost universally met with the exact same response. This is a civil matter, we cannot enforce a custody order, call your attorney on Monday. The systemic apathy in that moment is crushing. The father realizes that the institution that aggressively enforces his financial obligations is completely paralyzed when it comes to enforcing his parental access. This realization triggers a phenomenon researchers call institutional betrayal trauma. The psychological safety net he believed existed is exposed as an illusion. To understand the mechanics of this destruction, dissect the pathology of the alienating parent and how it targets the father's deepest psychological vulnerabilities. Historical trends in family psychology show that parental alienation does not typically begin with dramatic kidnappings. It begins as a slow, systematic campaign of psychological erosion. It is the death by 1,000 cuts. It starts with subtle interference. A scheduled phone call is missed because the children were supposedly taking a nap. A weekend is abruptly canceled because the child supposedly has a sudden illness, but no doctor's note is ever provided. The father is repeatedly positioned as an intruder disrupting the children's lives, rather than a fundamental pillar of it. Imagine a man named Robert, a 45-year-old software engineer living in Illinois in the year 2026. Robert secures a standard custody agreement granting him every other weekend and Wednesday dinners. For the first few months, the schedule is adhered to, but a subtle shift occurs. When Robert arrives to pick up his kids, they are uncharacteristically anxious. The custodial parent stands in the doorway, physically blocking the threshold, and asks the children in a deeply concerned, highly suggestive tone, "Are you sure you want to go with him? You do not have to if you feel unsafe." In a single, calculated moment, the seed of cognitive dissonance is planted in the child's mind. The custodial parent is implicitly signaling that Robert is a source of danger, simultaneously presenting herself as the sole protector. The child, entirely dependent on the primary caregiver for survival, begins to align with this manufactured fear. When Robert attempts to assert his legal right to his parenting time, the trap is sprung. Clinical case studies detailing the double bind of parental alienation reveal exactly how the father is cornered. If Robert raises his voice in frustration, expresses visible anger at the violation of the court order, or threatens to call his lawyer, the custodial parent immediately uses this reaction as evidence. "See how angry your father is? This is why we have to be careful." The father's completely rational frustration at being denied access to his children is weaponized and framed as abusive behavior. Psychologists call this reactive abuse provocation. The alienating parent pushes the target to the absolute edge of human endurance, waits for the inevitable emotional snap, and then records the reaction to prove the father is unhinged. Conversely, if Robert recognizes the trap, decides to de-escalate the situation, and walks away to avoid causing a scene in front of his children, he falls into the second half of the double bind. The alienating parent turns to the children and says, "See? He does not care enough to fight for you. He would rather just leave." In the clinical literature surrounding targeted parent rejection, this is considered a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Whether the father fights or retreats, the alienating parent controls the narrative, ensuring that every action Robert takes is filtered through a lens of inadequacy or danger. The psychological toll this exacts on the father is devastating. We are looking at potential outcomes that mirror the symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Unlike a single traumatic event, such as a car crash, the trauma of alienation is chronic, ongoing, and continuously evolving. Robert goes home to his empty apartment and begins obsessively reviewing text messages, emails, and past interactions, desperately searching for the mistake he must have made to cause his children to fear him. He is subjected to relentless gaslighting. The shared history of love, vacations, inside jokes, and paternal bonding is aggressively rewritten by the custodial parent. The father is told, both explicitly and implicitly, that he was never a good father, that his memories of a happy family are delusions, and that his children are thriving purely because of his absence. This systematic erasure of a man's lived reality causes profound psychological destabilization. Historical data regarding male mental health during high-conflict divorces indicates a terrifying correlation between prolonged parental alienation and the complete collapse of a man's executive functioning. The brain simply cannot process the cognitive load of loving a child who is being actively trained to despise him. The father's nervous system is locked in a perpetual state of hyperarousal, constantly anticipating the next false allegation, the next denied visit, or the next contemptuous email. This chronic stress severely impacts the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for logical decision-making and emotional regulation. Fathers in this phase frequently experience severe career derailment, as they can no longer concentrate on complex tasks. Their social isolation deepens into severe clinical depression, as they cannot articulate the bizarre Twilight Zone reality of their existence to friends or family, who have never experienced the subtle, lethal mechanics of family court gatekeeping. But the psychological warfare does not remain contained between the adults. The most devastating phase of this clinical dynamic occurs when the external manipulation becomes an internal reality for the child. The alienating parent's campaign of denigration eventually succeeds in breaking the child's psychological attachment to the father. The child begins to independently echo the adult vocabulary of the alienating parent, using terms like toxic, boundaries, and unsafe to describe a father who has never done anything but love them. When a father realizes that his own child has been completely subsumed by a false, hostile narrative, the trauma reaches its absolute apex. It is no longer just the system or the ex-spouse fighting him. The psychological weapon being used to destroy him is the very child he is trying to protect. What happens to the male psyche when the most sacred biological bond is weaponized against it? And how do the few who survive this ultimate betrayal manage to rebuild their cognitive framework from the ashes of complete psychological annihilation? When a man experiences the total psychological rejection from his own flesh and blood, a biological failsafe is triggered. Clinical psychiatrists often compare this state of mental collapse to the trauma of receiving a terminal diagnosis, but with a unique, agonizing twist. The source of the grief is physically alive, legally protected, and actively mandated to be hostile. The human brain is simply not wired to process this specific permutation of trauma. The evolutionary mandate to protect, nurture, and bond with one's offspring is violently short-circuited, resulting in a profound neurological crisis. We see a massive spike in neuroinflammation. We see historical trends in behavioral psychology showing a catastrophic surge in maladaptive coping mechanisms occurring right at this juncture. Severe social withdrawal, profound substance dependencies, and devastatingly high mortality rates are the potential outcomes when this foundational psychological anchor is severed. The man is forced to stare into a void where his entire purpose once resided, realizing that the system designed to protect his family has facilitated its psychological execution. Imagine if you are a 50-year-old man named Thomas, living in Pennsylvania in the year 2026. Thomas is a high school history teacher, a man who has dedicated his entire adult life to educating children and providing a stable middle-class life for his family. Following a brutal high-conflict divorce characterized by subtle but relentless custody gatekeeping, Thomas shows up for his court-ordered Wednesday dinner. He waits on the porch. The door opens and his 14-year-old son looks him dead in the eye, repeating a phrase that Thomas knows unequivocally was rehearsed and planted by his ex-wife. The boy says, "I do not want you in my life because you are toxic to my mental health." In that exact fraction of a second, the psychological annihilation is complete. Thomas cannot argue logic with a child who has been brainwashed. He cannot call the police to enforce love. He is entirely paralyzed. But this documentary is not merely an autopsy of a broken system. It is a clinical, rigorous examination of survival. How does a man like Thomas avoid becoming a grim statistic? We must look at the specific psychological scaffolding utilized by the men who managed to claw their way out of this abyss. The first, incredibly brutal step documented in successful clinical case studies is a concept known as radical acceptance. This is often profoundly misunderstood by the general public. Radical acceptance is not forgiveness. It is not condoning the abuse. It is certainly not giving up on the child. It is the absolute, unflinching acknowledgement of reality as it exists in this exact moment, entirely devoid of the persistent, agonizing hope that the family court system will suddenly become fair, or that the alienating parent will suddenly experience a moral epiphany. For years, the divorced father's brain has been locked in a toxic feedback loop of injustice. He has been fighting a ghost. He fights the ghost of the man he used to be, the ghost of the family unit that died, and the ghost of the legal justice he naively assumed he was entitled to as an American citizen. To survive the ultimate betrayal of parental alienation, the father must voluntarily undergo a psychological ego death. He has to let the old version of himself die completely. Step 1 of this cognitive restructuring involves severing the emotional umbilical cord that ties his self-worth to the validation of his ex-spouse or, tragically, to the immediate manipulated affection of his alienated child. This process runs completely counterintuitive to every biological instinct a father possesses. Psychologists refer to this necessary survival mechanism as strategic detachment. It is an act of extreme psychological triage. If Thomas continues to crash himself against the jagged rocks of his child's manufactured hostility, he will bleed out entirely, losing his career, his health, and his sanity. By stepping back, not abandoning the child, but strictly removing his emotional reactivity from the equation, he deprives the alienating parent of the very fuel required to keep the alienation fire burning. The pathology of the alienating parent demands the father's visible pain, anger, and desperation to prove to the child that the father is indeed unstable and dangerous. When a man like Thomas stops reacting, when he stops sending desperate text messages, when he stops fighting screaming matches on the front lawn, the dynamic fundamentally shifts. The alienator holds up to the child suddenly reflects nothing. However, implementing strategic detachment creates a massive psychological void. The man is now truly alone in the deepest sense of the word. His previous identity as a daily patriarch is dead. His daily utility is gone, and his primary emotional outlet has been heavily compromised. The silence in his apartment transforms from a temporary quiet into an existential vacuum. This is where historical trends in clinical resilience show a fascinating, almost miraculous divergence in human behavior. Men who survive this phase do not simply heal. They must construct an entirely new framework of meaning from scratch. They have to look in the mirror and answer a terrifying question. Who am I if I am not an active, daily father, a husband, or a provider for that specific household? We see case studies of men who, driven by sheer survival necessity, completely reinvent their neurochemistry through rigorous, almost monastic routines. Because the external world has proven to be entirely chaotic and unjust, they turn their focus entirely inward, taking absolute control over the only variables they have left. Physical exertion becomes a method of burning off toxic cortisol. Obsessive skill acquisition, whether in their careers or entirely new disciplines, becomes a way to rebuild self-efficacy. Deep immersion into Stoic philosophy or rigorous cognitive behavioral therapy becomes the new foundational pillar of their existence. They are essentially hacking their own dopamine systems, forcing their brains to find neurochemical rewards in self-improvement rather than in the external validation of a fractured family structure. These men learn through agonizing trial and error that their intrinsic value as human beings is not dictated by a family court judge's gavel, a flawed legal statute, or the poisoned words of a manipulated teenager. They begin the meticulous work of building a fortified, impenetrable fortress of self-worth that no ex-spouse and no broken institutional system can ever touch again. They rebuild their cognitive frameworks brick by brick, relying solely on empirical reality rather than societal expectations. But this reconstruction process is incredibly fragile, requiring a specific set of tools and a brutal honesty about the harsh realities of the modern world. And as these men begin to rise from the ashes, establishing this new, ironclad Stoic identity, they encounter a completely unexpected sociological phenomenon. What happens when this new, entirely self-reliant, emotionally detached version of the American father finally re-enters the societal arena? And how does this radical psychological transformation unexpectedly disrupt the very systems that initially tried to destroy him? When this newly forged, radically autonomous version of the American father steps back into the societal arena, the friction is immediate and profound. The family court system, the localized legal economy, and the alienating ex-spouse are all fundamentally predicated on a specific behavioral loop: provocation, reaction, litigation, and financial extraction. The entire machinery assumes that the father will continue to fight an unwinnable war out of sheer biological desperation. But what happens when the primary resource of that system simply stops playing the game? Sociologists and legal analysts observing modern family dynamics are documenting a massive, silent behavioral shift among divorced men, a phenomenon we can categorize as the financial and emotional quiet quitting of the adversarial system. By utilizing the strategic detachment we previously explored, these men inadvertently trigger a massive disruption in the multi-billion-dollar divorce industry, shifting the balance of power through the absolute refusal to engage. The American family law apparatus thrives on sustained conflict. Historical trends indicate that contentious custody battles generate exponential revenue for attorneys, psychological evaluators, paralegals, and court-appointed mediators. The system essentially taxes the father's love for his children, demanding endless billable hours to secure marginal increases in parenting time. The system expects the father to bleed himself dry trying to prove his psychological worth against moving goalposts. But the Stoic father, having undergone his psychological ego death and embraced radical acceptance, recognizes the trap. He accepts the unfair baseline custody order not out of weakness or apathy, but out of tactical, long-term financial and emotional preservation. He stops responding to the inflammatory text messages and emails explicitly designed by the alienating parent to drag him back into the courtroom. He stops funding the conflict, completely starving the legal machinery of its primary fuel source. Imagine a man named James, a 39-year-old structural engineer living in California in the year 2026. Over the course of 2 years, James has spent $80,000 in legal fees, liquidating his retirement accounts only to be granted a highly restrictive every other weekend schedule. His ex-spouse, sensing his depletion and seeking to maintain dominance, files a frivolous legal motion regarding a minor discrepancy in holiday transportation. She fully expects James to authorize his attorney to engage in a $10,000 counterfiling, perpetuating the cycle of anxiety and financial ruin. The old version of James would have fought tooth and nail out of principle. The new James, operating under the framework of strategic detachment, simply concedes to the petty demand or ignores the emotional bait entirely. He officially dismisses his legal counsel, stepping out of the arena. The litigation engine instantly stalls. By refusing to defend his ego in a rigged courtroom, James retains his remaining capital and preserves his neurological health. He redirects that immense financial and emotional energy into compound interest, career advancement, and rigorous personal health optimization. The localized legal industry that relied on his desperation suddenly finds itself staring at a wall of silence. This financial preservation is merely the first layer of the disruption. The deeper, more structural disruption is psychological and cultural. The traditional, culturally accepted metric of fatherhood in America is based on daily physical presence, the micromanagement of the child's schedule, and immediate behavioral correction. When that capacity is legally stripped away, the rebuilt man must entirely redefine his legacy. We see a fascinating trend in longitudinal case studies where these surviving men transition into what behavioral psychologists might term the lighthouse father. A lighthouse does not run frantically around the ocean chasing ships through a hurricane. It stands absolutely still, structurally reinforced against the elements, and shines a brilliant, unwavering light for those trying to navigate their way back to shore. The lighthouse father stops trying to force his presence on a child who is actively being manipulated into fearing him. Instead, he focuses entirely on becoming an undeniable, observable pillar of success, emotional stability, and self-mastery. He builds a life so demonstrably healthy and productive that it stands in direct, glaring contradiction to the alienator's fabricated narrative of him being toxic, abusive, or unstable. He creates an irrevocable trust for his children's future education. He builds resilient businesses, and he masters new physical or intellectual disciplines. He becomes a silent, impenetrable benefactor. This creates a profound and dangerous cognitive dissonance for the alienating parent, whose entire psychological framework relies on the father's visible destruction to validate their victimhood narrative to the children and to society. When the father thrives exponentially instead of crumbling into dysfunction, the alienator's manufactured reality begins to severely fracture. On a macro level, this transformation fundamentally alters modern consumer economics. Historical trends show that men immediately post-divorce often experience severe downward mobility, moving into transient or substandard housing and struggling to maintain basic living standards while paying exorbitant child support, alimony, and legal fees. However, the men who successfully navigate this psychological gauntlet and reach the other side adopt a hyper-efficient, minimalist lifestyle. They are no longer funding the bloated consumerism of the modern American nuclear family. They drastically downsize their footprint, ruthlessly eliminate consumer debt, and focus on extreme capital accumulation and personal freedom. This growing demographic of highly competent, financially efficient, and legally untethered men represents a massive unacknowledged shift in the labor and consumer markets. They become largely immune to traditional societal pressures in consumer marketing because the absolute worst thing society could effectively do to them, dismantling their family and weaponizing their children against them, has already occurred. They have survived the worst-case scenario, rendering them virtually bulletproof to standard socioeconomic manipulation. Let us look closer at the internal psychology required to maintain this transformation. The transition from an active, daily parent to a stoic, distant observer requires an absolute masterclass in emotional compartmentalization. The father must learn to celebrate his children's life milestones, 16th birthdays, high school graduations, athletic achievements, and college acceptances, in absolute silence, often from a distance, and entirely without the expectation of gratitude, reciprocation, or even acknowledgement. Potential outcomes for men who fail to maintain this rigorous compartmentalization include a catastrophic return to the cycle of bitterness, depression, and reactive litigation. But for those who successfully master it, the clinical result is a profound, almost untouchable inner peace. They learn to love their children without the condition of proximity or validation. This unconditional, completely non-transactional love is arguably the purest form of fatherhood, forged not in the warmth of a daily household, but in the freezing vacuum of forced separation and institutional apathy. The system assumed he would break. The alienator assumed he would eventually destroy himself out of grief. Instead, he adapted, evolved, and built an impenetrable psychological fortress. He neutralized the legal attacks by permanently refusing to participate, and he neutralized the emotional attacks by mastering his own neurochemistry, covering his reliance on external validation. He stands completely still, functioning perfectly, quietly accumulating resources, and waiting for the clock to run out on the family court's jurisdiction. Because the one fundamental law of physics that the alienating parent, the attorneys, and the legal system cannot manipulate or control is the passage of time. Children age. Frontal lobes develop. Critical thinking skills emerge. The court order that legally enforces the separation, and the power dynamic of the alienating household, expires the very second that child turns 18. And this is exactly where the entire psychological architecture of parental alienation faces its ultimate, terrifying, and inescapable reckoning. What happens when the manipulated child officially becomes a legal adult, steps out from the suffocating shadow of the alienating parent, and begins to independently verify the reality they were forced to believe for their entire childhood? What is the exact step-by-step psychological sequence that occurs when the child finally turns around and looks directly at the lighthouse? When the clock strikes midnight on the child's 18th birthday, an invisible but monumental psychological shift occurs. The court order, the heavily weaponized document that defined the power dynamic for years, instantly disintegrates. The alienating parent no longer possesses the legal authority to gatekeep communication, restrict physical proximity, or legally enforce the narrative. For the first time in perhaps a decade, the institutional barrier between the child and the lighthouse father is removed. However, the psychological barrier, the deep-seated conditioning, remains entirely intact. The child does not wake up on their 18th birthday suddenly enlightened. They wake up carrying the psychological programming of the alienator, but they are now stepping into an environment where that programming will face its first genuine exposure to empirical reality. To understand how this conditioning unravels, we must examine the neurological development occurring in a young adult. Between the ages of 18 and 25, the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for complex decision-making, understanding nuance, and evaluating abstract concepts, undergoes its final and most crucial phase of maturation. Children operate heavily on binary thinking. Good versus evil, safe versus unsafe. The alienating parent exploited this biological limitation by painting themselves as the absolute victim, and the father as the absolute villain. But as the child transitions into young adulthood and enters the collegiate or professional workforce, they begin to encounter the extreme complexity of human relationships. They begin to realize that adults are rarely caricatures of pure malice or pure virtue. This neurological maturation creates the fertile ground for the very first seeds of cognitive dissonance. Imagine a young woman named Sarah, a 19-year-old college sophomore living in Michigan in the year 2026. For 10 years, Sarah was conditioned to believe her father, Marcus, was a dangerous, financially abusive man who abandoned the family. Her custodial parent meticulously curated every piece of information Sarah received, framing every missed child support payment, which was actually caught in a bureaucratic delay, as a deliberate act of starvation, and framing every frustrated email from Marcus as evidence of a volatile temper. But in 2026, Sarah is out of the house. She is taking psychology courses. She is witnessing the flawed dynamics of her peers' relationships. And most importantly, she is no longer under the 24-hour surveillance of the alienating parent. The unraveling rarely begins with a dramatic confrontation. Historical trends in reunification psychology show that it almost always begins with a minor inconsistency. Sarah needs a copy of her birth certificate or an old medical record for university registration, and while digging through a box of old files in the attic during a visit home, she finds a stack of court documents. Or perhaps she finds an old hard drive containing hundreds of unanswered emails from Marcus. As her newly matured prefrontal cortex processes this unfiltered data, the narrative fractures. She reads emails where Marcus begs for 5 minutes on the phone. She sees financial ledgers proving he paid tens of thousands of dollars in support. She sees the desperately sad, remarkably calm tone of a man who is fighting a ghost, completely contradicting the terrifying monster she was relentlessly warned about. This discovery triggers a phase psychologists term independent verification. The young adult, reeling from the cognitive shock, begins to silently investigate. They observe the lighthouse father from a distance. Sarah finds Marcus's professional profile online. She sees that he is a respected civil engineer. She sees that he has maintained steady employment, perhaps built a new, stable family life, and exhibits absolutely none of the erratic, dangerous behaviors her primary caregiver described. He has stood still, a beacon of stability, exactly as his Stoic philosophy demanded. The cognitive dissonance now reaches a critical mass. The young adult must reconcile the fabricated memory of the father with the empirical, undeniable reality of the man standing before them. When the realization fully solidifies that the alienating parent, the person the child relied on entirely for survival and truth, has systematically lied for over a decade, a massive psychological rupture occurs. This is not a simple disagreement. It is the total collapse of the young adult's foundational reality. The alienating parent's strategy completely backfires. The intense hostility that was meticulously programmed into the child is violently redirected back at the programmer. The young adult realizes they were weaponized. They realize they were robbed of a father, not by the father's actions, but by the custodial parent's pathology. Clinical case studies show that young adults in this phase experience profound grief, profound anger, and a desperate, urgent need to reach out to the targeted parent to apologize for a dynamic they were brainwashed into participating in. The approach is entirely tentative. Sarah sends a brief, incredibly cautious message to Marcus. A simple hello or a question about a medical history. This is the precise moment where the father's years of strategic detachment and stoic training face their ultimate test. If Marcus reacts with overwhelming emotion, if he unleashes years of pent-up frustration, or worse, if he immediately attacks the other parent and says, "I told you they were lying," he risks triggering the young adult's deeply ingrained defense mechanisms. The programming is fractured, but it is not completely erased. A trauma response can still be easily triggered by rapid emotional escalation. But Marcus is a lighthouse father. He has prepared for this moment for a decade. He responds with steady, unconditional warmth. He does not demand an apology. He does not trauma dump his years of suffering onto his daughter. He simply opens the door, validates her courage in reaching out, and allows her to set the pace of the reunification. He provides the exact opposite experience of the emotionally demanding, highly enmeshed environment she grew up in. This non-reactive, deeply secure response provides the final empirical proof the young adult needs. The father is safe. The father is stable. The father never stopped loving them. The reunification process is agonizingly slow, requiring immense patience. They must build a relationship entirely from scratch, bridging a massive canyon of lost time and fabricated memories. They cautiously begin meeting for coffee, exchanging stories, and slowly dismantling the lies brick by brick. For the father, it is the quiet, monumental victory of a decade-long war of psychological attrition. He survived, and his child found their way back to the light. However, this beautiful, fragile reconstruction does not occur in a vacuum. The alienating parent, who relies entirely on the child's enmeshment for their own psychological stability, eventually senses the shift. The control is slipping. The child is pulling away and asking dangerous, verifying questions. When the pathology of the alienator is threatened by the very truth they spent a lifetime suppressing, they do not simply concede defeat. What happens when the alienating parent realizes their grand illusion has been shattered? And what terrifying, extreme psychological tactics do they deploy as a final, desperate extinction burst to drag the young adult back into the delusion and destroy the fragile, newly formed bond with the father? In behavioral psychology, there is a precisely documented phenomenon known as an extinction burst. When an organism is conditioned to receive a specific reward for a specific behavior, and that reward is suddenly removed, the organism does not immediately adapt. Instead, the behavior escalates into a frantic, chaotic, and highly volatile overdrive before it finally extinguishes. When applied to the pathology of parental alienation, the extinction burst represents the most dangerous and psychologically violent phase of the entire family dissolution timeline. The alienating parent has spent a decade feeding their own fragile psychological architecture, with the absolute control of the child and the systematic destruction of the father. When that adult child begins to verify reality, demonstrating independent thought and cautiously stepping toward the lighthouse father, the alienator's entire source of psychological supply is threatened. They do not experience an epiphany of guilt. They experience an existential panic. And in this state of panic, historical trends in family psychology reveal that they deploy an arsenal of extreme coercive tactics designed to shatter the young adult's independence and drag them back into the shared delusion. Imagine a young man named Liam, 20 years old, attending a university in Florida in the year 2026. After uncovering a cache of old court documents that contradicted his lifelong programming, Liam initiated a series of quiet, profoundly healing conversations with his father. For the first time in his life, Liam is experiencing unconditional, non-reactive parental love. However, Liam still resides under the primary financial and emotional umbrella of his alienating mother. The moment the mother senses a shift in Liam's vocabulary, a subtle withdrawal of his enmeshment, or uncovers digital evidence of his communication with his father, the first phase of the extinction burst is deployed, the manufactured somatic crisis. Because the alienator can no longer rely on the family court system to legally mandate separation, they must manufacture an inescapable moral obligation to prevent the young adult from leaving. Clinical case studies tracking reunification sabotage show a startling pattern where the alienating parent suddenly develops mysterious, highly acute physical ailments or profound, debilitating psychological crises that perfectly coincide with the young adult's attempts to see their father. On the very afternoon Liam is scheduled to meet his father for coffee, his mother will call him from the emergency room, claiming heart palpitations, or she will suffer a manufactured nervous breakdown, weeping uncontrollably on the kitchen floor. The psychological mechanic here is brutal and highly effective. It forces Liam into a horrific double bind. If he goes to see his father, he is framed as a callous, abusive son who is abandoning his mother in her hour of most desperate medical or emotional need. The alienator aggressively weaponizes Liam's empathy, shifting their own role from the ultimate protector to the ultimate victim, and implicitly tying their very survival to Liam's immediate obedience and physical presence. This is a severe form of clinical parentification, where the child is violently forced to bear the emotional regulatory burden of the adult. When the manufactured somatic crisis fails to permanently sever the newly formed bond, the alienator immediately pivots to the most powerful tool left in their arsenal: financial blackmail and resource control. In the modern United States, a young adult pursuing higher education or trying to establish independent housing is incredibly vulnerable to economic coercion. Historical trends indicate that alienating parents will ruthlessly leverage this vulnerability to enforce psychological compliance. The mother will sit Liam down and explicitly outline the new transactional nature of their relationship. She will threaten to pull her contribution to his college tuition, refuse to sign his federal financial aid documents, or threaten to revoke his access to his vehicle and housing if he continues to communicate with his father. The mask of the loving, protective parent slips entirely, revealing a transactional dictator. The young adult is forced to calculate the literal price of knowing their own father. They are threatened with catastrophic downward mobility and the destruction of their educational future, simply for seeking the truth about their own family history. If the young adult exhibits the immense psychological fortitude required to withstand the financial abuse, the alienating parent will escalate to the third and most devastating tactic: sibling triangulation and the familial smear campaign. The alienator knows that if one child escapes the programming, the entire narrative is at risk of collapsing for the remaining children. To prevent a mass defection, the alienator turns the defector into an undeniable villain. Potential outcomes of this phase include the complete fracturing of the sibling unit. The mother will gather Liam's younger siblings and construct a narrative that Liam has been brainwashed, that he is betraying the family, and that he is engaging in reckless, dangerous behavior by associating with the toxic father. The siblings, still entirely dependent on the alienator for their own survival, are coerced into cutting contact with Liam. Liam is not just losing his mother, he is being systematically excommunicated from his entire extended family network. He is painted as a traitor, and his phone falls silent as brothers, sisters, aunts, and uncles are drafted into the alienator's defensive army. This sequence of extreme psychological abuse triggers the ultimate cognitive crisis for the young adult. For their entire life, they were told that the father was the source of all conditional love, instability, and danger. But as the extinction burst reaches its climax, the empirical reality becomes utterly undeniable. The young adult looks at the alienating parent and realizes a terrifying, life-altering truth. The love they received in that household was never actually about them as an independent human being. It was entirely conditional upon their utility as a weapon against the father. The moment they ceased to be a weapon, the love was instantly replaced with financial extortion, emotional blackmail, and familial exile. The psychological foundation of their entire childhood crumbles into dust. They realize they were a hostage who fell in love with their captor. This is the exact moment where the father's decade of stoic preparation and strategic detachment proves to be the ultimate saving grace. When Liam, completely shattered by his mother's financial threats and the loss of his siblings, arrives at his father's doorstep, the father does not gloat. He does not say, "I told you she was a monster." He does not use Liam's trauma as an opportunity to litigate the past. The lighthouse father simply opens the door, provides immediate, unquestioning psychological safety, and offers the absolute emotional regulation that Liam desperately needs. The father absorbs the young adult's grief without making it about his own lost decade. By providing an environment entirely devoid of transactional demands or emotional manipulation, the father permanently cements the reality of who he actually is, extinguishing the alienator's programming forever. The cycle of generational trauma is finally violently broken. But the survival of one young adult, or even thousands of them, represents something much larger than a series of individual family tragedies. As these young men and women mature, graduate, and enter the professional workforce, they carry with them the brutal empirical knowledge of exactly how the American family court system facilitated their childhood abuse. They possess the vocabulary, the education, and the unyielding anger of a generation that was weaponized for profit. What happens when this specific cohort of survivors, the children of the lighthouse fathers, begins to age into positions of legal, political, and cultural power? How does the accumulated, silent suffering of millions of divorced men suddenly translate into a massive, unstoppable societal backlash that threatens to tear down the very foundations of the multi-billion-dollar divorce industry? Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The information presented in this documentary is intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. While we delve deeply into psychological studies, legal reform trends, and family dynamics, this content does not constitute professional psychiatric, medical, or legal advice. Navigating the complexities of divorce, family court, and legislative action involves intricate personal, legal, and mental health challenges. Always seek the guidance of qualified professionals, such as licensed therapists, family law attorneys, or medical providers, regarding your specific circumstances. Viewers must conduct their own due diligence before making any life-altering decisions based on the themes discussed herein. The demographic shift currently underway in the United States is creating a perfect storm for the family law establishment. For decades, the multi-billion-dollar divorce industry operated with near-total impunity because its primary critics were the very men it had just stripped of assets and emotional stability. When a financially devastated, emotionally traumatized father stood up to point out the systemic bias of the family court system, he was universally dismissed by mainstream society. The system effortlessly categorized him as a bitter, disgruntled ex-husband, neutralizing his legitimate grievances with a cultural stereotype. But the system made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. It assumed the children, the silent observers of this institutional trauma, would remain permanently blinded by the alienating parent's narrative. It failed to account for the neurological maturation, the prefrontal cortex development, and the eventual independent verification process we just dissected. As we navigate through the year 2026, we are witnessing the terrifying, unstoppable rise of a completely new demographic: the adult survivors of court-sanctioned parental alienation. These are the children of the lighthouse fathers. They are now graduating from law schools, entering clinical psychology programs, and securing seats in state legislatures. And they are carrying a profound, quiet fury. Unlike their fathers, who were severely compromised by the acute biological shock of divorce and the agonizing grief of separation, this new generation operates with cold, empirical precision. They possess the clinical vocabulary to articulate exactly how they were weaponized. They have the psychological studies, the historical trends, and their own lived experiences to prove that the adversarial legal system did not protect them, but rather actively facilitated their psychological abuse for profit. Imagine a young man named Marcus, 28 years old, standing before a state Senate Judiciary Committee in the year 2026. Marcus is not an angry ex-spouse. He is a highly educated attorney specializing in civil rights litigation. He methodically lays out the step-by-step destruction of his own childhood. He submits into the legislative record the exact court orders that stripped his loving, stable father of custody, based on unverified, fabricated allegations submitted by his mother. He details the financial ruin his father endured simply trying to maintain a baseline relationship with his son. But Marcus does not stop at his own story. He presents aggregate data, peer-reviewed psychological studies, and undeniable historical trends demonstrating that his experience is not an anomaly, but a highly profitable business model utilized by family courts nationwide. When an adult child of divorce looks a panel of lawmakers in the eye and explicitly blames the legal framework for robbing him of a father, the bitter ex-husband stereotype instantly disintegrates. The narrative completely flips. The system is no longer protecting the child from the father. The system is being exposed for protecting the abuser from accountability. This vocalized, highly educated backlash is terrifying to the established legal economy because it attacks the very foundation of their revenue model. The divorce industry, encompassing hourly attorneys, custody evaluators, and therapeutic interventionists, thrives on prolonged, high-conflict litigation. This conflict is heavily subsidized by the outdated presumption that one parent must be the primary winner and the other the secondary loser. But the coalition of adult survivors and stoic rebuilt fathers is systematically dismantling this framework. We are observing potential outcomes that include massive shifts in consumer behavior within the legal market. Fathers, educated by the survival tactics of the men who came before them, are increasingly refusing to participate in the adversarial slaughter. They are utilizing alternative dispute resolution, demanding binding arbitration outside of the courtroom, or effectively starving the beast through the strategic detachment we previously analyzed. They are deliberately bleeding the conflict dry of emotional and financial capital. Simultaneously, the adult survivors are organizing grassroots legislative movements demanding structural reform. They are pushing for statutory mandates establishing absolute, 50-50 shared parenting as the non-negotiable default in every divorce case, fundamentally removing the financial incentive to alienate a targeted parent. If a mother knows that making false allegations will no longer automatically secure her primary custody and the accompanying financial support, but instead will trigger a rigorous, immediate investigation into her own psychological stability and potential alienating behaviors, the primary weapon of the high-conflict divorce is instantly neutralized. The burden of proof is shifting. The psychological studies detailing the catastrophic neurological impact of fatherlessness are no longer being relegated to obscure academic journals. They are being weaponized as legal precedent to sue the very institutions that perpetuated the damage. We are seeing case studies of civil litigation targeting court-appointed psychologists who consistently fail to identify obvious alienation tactics. We are seeing a profound cultural demand for judicial accountability, where judges who continuously issue highly restricted custody orders to fit, loving fathers are facing aggressive public exposure and electoral challenges funded by the very men they previously impoverished. The multi-billion-dollar machinery is experiencing a systemic shock because the raw material it used to manufacture its wealth, the unconditional love of an American father for his child, is no longer blindly walking into the slaughterhouse. The fathers have learned to stand entirely still as lighthouses, preserving their resources and their sanity, while their adult children are aggressively storming the shores to dismantle the system from the inside out. This structural revolution is not a distant possibility. It is a measurable, observable shift occurring in real time. The psychological studies have vindicated the divorced dad. The longitudinal data has proven that his presence is not a luxury, but a fundamental biological necessity for the neurological health of his offspring. The decades of silent suffering, the men who collapsed under the weight of disenfranchised grief, and the fathers who endured the agony of identity foreclosure did not suffer entirely in vain. Their collective trauma provided the empirical data necessary to trigger this massive societal correction. But while the macro-level statistics are shifting and the legislative battles are being waged in the Capitol buildings, there remains the immediate, terrifying micro-level reality of the individual man. The societal backlash provides context, but it does not provide comfort at 2 a.m. when the silence of the empty apartment becomes deafening. For the man who is currently standing at the very beginning of this catastrophic timeline, the man who has just been served papers, who is currently drowning in the acute phase of biological displacement and facing the complete annihilation of his known universe, the question is not about what happens in the year 2026. The question is entirely about how he survives tomorrow. What is the exact, unyielding, step-by-step daily protocol required to physically and psychologically endure the darkest chapter of human existence? And how does a man completely rebuild his life from absolute zero when the entire world has told him he is obsolete? To physically and psychologically endure the darkest chapter of human existence, and to completely rebuild a life from absolute zero when the entire world has told a man he is obsolete, requires a framework of survival so rigid and deliberate that it leaves absolutely no room for despair. Clinical psychologists working with severe trauma recognize that in the immediate aftermath of a systemic collapse, motivation is a myth. Relying on willpower is a fatal error. What is required is a protocol. The initial 90 days post-separation are not about thriving or long-term planning. They are exclusively about biological stabilization. We observe case studies of men who successfully navigate this acute phase, and their strategies consistently mirror those of specialized military units operating in hostile environments. The primary objective is the aggressive regulation of the central nervous system. Imagine a man named Christopher, a 40-year-old electrician living in Colorado in the year 2026. Christopher has just been handed a temporary order that cuts his income, liquidates his savings, and restricts his parenting time to 4 days a month. If Christopher allows his mind to project 10 years into the future, the cognitive weight of that institutional injustice will literally crush him. The survival protocol demands that Christopher drastically shrink his temporal horizon. He cannot control the family court judge. He cannot control the narrative his ex-spouse is spinning. He can only control the next 24 hours. He mandates an ironclad sleep schedule to prevent the psychosis of insomnia. He completely eradicates the consumption of alcohol or any central nervous system depressants, which historical trends show are the primary catalyst for the disastrous, emotionally volatile late-night communications that permanently destroy legal standing. He wakes up at 5 in the morning and engages in intense physical exertion. He utilizes this exercise not for aesthetic purposes, but as a mandatory biological mechanism to burn off the toxic levels of cortisol flooding his bloodstream. He goes to his job. He maintains absolute, disciplined silence regarding his legal battles while on the clock, aggressively compartmentalizing his trauma to protect his sole remaining source of resource generation. Once this biological baseline is secured through relentless routine, the profound psychological reconstruction must begin. This involves the brutal and entirely necessary eradication of the victim identity. The family court system may have indeed victimized him, and the alienating parent may be actively abusing his children, but adopting the psychological posture of a victim is a terminal cognitive condition. The men who emerge from this abyss undergo a rigorous process that cognitive behavioral therapists call radical accountability. They stop asking why this happened to them, a question that breeds an endless, paralyzing loop of resentment, and they begin asking what they must become to overcome it. They forcibly evict the ex-spouse from their internal monologue. Every ounce of cognitive energy spent analyzing the unfairness of the situation is energy directly stolen from their own reconstruction. They must accept that the cavalry is not coming. There is no societal safety net designed to catch a falling father. He must become his own rescue apparatus. This brings us to the terrifying reality of rebuilding an empire from absolute zero. Historical trends in post-divorce economics are notoriously grim, often showing a catastrophic loss of wealth, property, and retirement security for the non-custodial parent. But within this financial devastation lies a paradoxical, highly documented psychological liberation. When a man is abruptly stripped of the suburban house, the societal status, and the conventional markers of middle-class success, he is fundamentally freed from the consumerist treadmill that previously dictated his existence. We are seeing the massive emergence of extreme financial minimalism among divorced fathers. These men are increasingly rejecting the cultural narrative that they must immediately purchase a duplicate, fully furnished family home to prove their paternal worth to a judge. Instead, they are optimizing for hyperliquidity, geographic mobility, and absolute financial independence. They are ruthlessly eliminating consumer debt, living in highly efficient spaces, and redirecting all available capital into investments and skill acquisition. They realize that their ultimate, long-term utility to their children is not a heavily mortgaged guest bedroom, but the existence of a financially bulletproof, emotionally unshakable patriarch who cannot be broken by external institutional forces. This is the final, magnificent realization of the Lighthouse Father blueprint. He begins to understand that the legal system operates purely on paper, but human legacy operates in reality. A court order can dictate physical proximity, but it cannot dictate respect, competence, or character. By focusing entirely on mastering his own physical, mental, and financial domain, the father creates an undeniable, observable gravitational pull. When his children, whether at age 10, 18, or 25, inevitably begin to look past the manufactured chaos of their primary residence, they will see a man who stood absolutely firm in the storm. They will see a man who did not self-destruct, who did not abandon them out of spite, and who quietly built a fortress of stability out of the ashes of his former life. This observable resilience becomes the most profound psychological lesson a father can ever impart to his offspring. It teaches the child that while systemic injustice absolutely exists, it does not have the power to define their reality unless they surrender to it. As we observe this phenomenon across the United States, we are witnessing the quiet, unstoppable formation of a completely new, highly resilient demographic. Millions of men are walking around with the profound, unspoken shared experience. They are the men who legally lost everything and survived anyway. They are operating in our workplaces, directing logistics, engineering infrastructure, and quietly reshaping the Stoic ideal for the modern era. They possess a psychological armor forged in the most brutal adversarial legal system in the Western world. This collective resilience is beginning to radiate outward, subtly altering how communities view fatherhood, emotional endurance, and the very nature of family law. The narrative is violently shifting from a tragedy of broken homes to a masterclass in supreme human endurance. Over the course of this extensive exploration, we have dismantled the cultural stereotypes, exposed the institutional biases, and charted the agonizing heroic cognitive journey of the divorced American dad. We have looked at the restricted clinical data, the shifting historical trends, and the undeniable empirical truth that fatherhood cannot be extinguished by a judicial gavel. But as this new generation of unbreakable men continues to rise, and as their newly matured adult children step forward to demand legislative reckoning for the childhoods they lost to a profitable legal machine, a massive, unanswerable question looms over the horizon. We have now seen exactly what happens when the father rebuilds himself into an impenetrable force, but what happens to the massive societal and economic structures that heavily relied on his destruction? When the multi-billion-dollar divorce industry finally begins to collapse under the weight of its own exposed obsolescence and the unified boycott of its primary targets, what new, potentially dangerous legal paradigms will emerge to take its place? And is the American economy entirely prepared for the radical, unforeseen consequences of a society where highly competent men simply choose to completely opt out of the institution of modern marriage altogether?